Welcome to our discussion. In terms of leading off our discussion, there are two facts that I thought are pretty interesting that are relevant. One is that for many years, US government data has shown that women are 73% more at risk for injury in automobile accidents, 17% more at risk of dying in an accident than their male counterparts. And so we're here to discuss, how is this possible? How is it possible that women are more vulnerable to injury and death in a car crash than men, and what can be done about it? And in many ways, it's really hard to believe that we're talking about this issue in 2021. I would certainly have thought that this issue would have been addressed in prior administrations, but this is a new administration, and perhaps this is a public policy issue that the Biden administration and the Department of Transportation could take up. And we'll talk about that with a great panel that we have together. First, we have Caroline Criado Perez. She is the author of a best-selling book called Invisible Women, Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. She's a journalist. She's a feminist campaigner. She's known for getting the first woman on the British banknotes and also the first statue of a woman in Parliament Square. We also have Chris O'Connor, who is an engineer by background. He's also president and CEO of Humanetics. That's the maker of those iconic crash test dummies. Those are the devices that are used to measure the impacts on occupants on every car and also every space mission from Apollo onwards. And lastly, we have Susan Molinari, politician, journalist, lobbyist, a 5-time representative from Staten Island, New York City, and a CBS broadcaster, and also a public affairs executive for companies like Google. So thanks for each of you for taking the time to talk about this really topical and relevant issue. And Caroline, I want to start off with you. I mentioned your book, and why did you write this book, Invisible Women, in the first place?
Well, I guess like you, I started to come across these kinds of examples because it's not just in crash test dummies, unfortunately, where we seem to be substituting the average man as representative of the average human. And so I was coming across examples. The first example actually I came across was in medicine, which is equally shocking and equally life-threatening. So for example, women are much more likely to be misdiagnosed if they have a heart attack because the female heart attack symptoms don't necessarily conform to what we think of as the classic Hollywood heart attack symptoms of pain in the chest and down the left arm. And so women are less likely to realize they're having a heart attack. Also, doctors are less likely to diagnose it. And as I started looking into it, I started finding that this issue of having the average male representing humanity just kept cropping up in areas that you just wouldn't think of, from snow clearing to medicine and of course to car crash test dummies. And so this was an area that for me was also incredibly shocking. So I started to look into it. How was it, as you say? I mean, I was writing the book sort of 4 years ago now. It came out in 2019. How was it that we were still having this conversation, that we somehow had got to a point where, I don't know, almost no one had noticed how ridiculous it is to be testing a car that's meant to be safe for all types of people, and we're using an average man as the representative. And as a result, of course, women are much more at risk if they get in a car crash than a man in the same car crash.
Well, why is this happening? Why are we in 2021 and the regulations are such that there is a crash test dummy for a male driver, and although there's a crash test dummy for women drivers, it's not actually used in those 5-star ratings that we're all familiar with when we go to purchase an automobile?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a bit of history here, of course, and I would argue it goes back to this bias that we all shared, that you do see cropping up in all sorts of areas where we have this weird thing that we think of men as somehow unisex, as somehow gender neutral, which of course they're not. But that's kind of where perhaps it started off. And since, in the history of car crash test dummies, there have been attempts to introduce female car crash test dummies. Like back in the 80s, there was a suggestion that we'd want to include a 5th percentile female, which means only 5% of users would be smaller, a 50th percentile female, and a 95th percentile male. The average woman was the one that got dropped out of those 4, which is a kind of pattern that you see repeating across all these areas that we sort of think, well, we don't really need the women. They're kind of a bit niche. So let's just forget them. So that's how we've kind of ended up where we have a 5th percentile female and then 2 male dummies. And again, you know, I would argue that perhaps that is also why, even though we have this 5th percentile female dummy, who I'm sure Chris will go into details more on, that actually the one we've been using up until this point is really just a scaled down male dummy and doesn't take into account a lot of the anthropometric differences between male and female bodies. You know, things like women have less muscle mass in their neck and their upper body, which puts them at higher risk for all sorts of different kinds of injuries. But as you say, we're not actually using this dummy in the majority of the tests. So in the majority of the tests, even though we do have this smaller dummy, we're still doing most of them on this average male dummy. And that is for the frontal tests, but also more specifically things like rear impact tests. As far as I'm aware, there is only 1/50th percentile male dummy that we use in those tests, even though women are much more likely to experience whiplash, which is what you get from a rear impact crash, for example.
Chris, let me come to you. Why are women more at risk? What is it about women, the way that they're built, that makes them more susceptible to injury in crashes involving other automobiles?
Well, John, there's a lot of variables in a crash, as you can imagine. Caroline points out frontal crash, side crashes, rear impact crashes, and there's certainly a lot of variabilities in the human being. And there is differences, obviously, on how we're seeing injuries today with a woman versus a man. And these are well recorded. We've seen an increase in fatalities. We've seen an increase in injuries. A lot of the injuries, again, depend on the circumstances of the crash, do revolve around the neck and the back, the spine. But also on a frontal crash, we see a lot of lower leg injuries in a female that are much more severe than a man would experience. And as Caroline points out, I think if you go back in the history of the crash test dummy in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and then what became the hybrid 3, which was the 3rd generation, it was scaled around a male. And though there were some changes that were made for that 1/5 percentile, it really was the male geometry for which the original crash test dummy was created. And quite frankly, that is well over 40 years ago that it was developed. And even people, as you know it today, are much different in size and shape, as well as technology has advanced significantly over these last 40 years. And unfortunately, we're still using predominantly a 40-year standard. And I think maybe from the 50s and 60s timeframe, it was more envisioned that a male would be driving and a female would be a passenger or in the back seat. And that's how most of the tests are set up. There are some tests where a female is in the driver's seat, but the majority of tests are around a male in the driver's seat. And as we all know, 51% in the US of drivers are actually female. There's actually more female drivers than male. So the standards and the concept have certainly just arisen, continued from a historic viewpoint.
So Chris, what can be done to make this more equitable?
Well, a lot can be done. In fact, many things have been done. So there is a new crash test dummy called the Thor. The Thor is built as a 50th and a 5th. And it's significantly different. It's more anatomically correct. If you compare the two side by side, it's very noticeable, the difference in the rib cage, the thorax, the pelvis, the areas of concern, because technology has changed. The number of sensors, so data points, you can get channels of data that used to be on a hybrid, you might have 10, you could have 30. points of data. Now you can have 150 to 200 points of data. So just imagine all the additional data that you are getting. But what are the design changes specifically for a female based on the injury? If you look at the thorax has a single point of measurement in a hybrid 3. It now has a 4-point measurement system that provides a lot more data. The pelvic bone, which is an area of concern in the pelvis, as well as the femur, which is a high injury rate, that has been changed. It has more measurement devices there. The abdomen, which is another area, especially with seatbelt loading on females, that has different sensors. The lower leg, we mentioned before, has additional sensors. And again, the amount of data we can take off that is significantly more. So by using the most advanced tool, instead of a tool that's 40 years old, OEMs, car makers, suppliers of safety equipment like seatbelts and airbags and others can get a lot of data off this. And it is available today. So Europe has now adopted it in their NCAP for the male, but they have not adopted the female yet. China and Japan is to follow. And the US is still completely uncertain on when they will adopt it. So actually the US has fallen a little behind. But this same technology and all the features that I mentioned are available in a female version, and that has not been adopted yet. So we're very slow to get new technology into the testing regulatory process.
Susan, is this something that the Congress can do something about? Is it something that agencies can do something about in terms of making things more equitable, making things so that when a woman goes to purchase a car at her car dealership, she knows when she reads the 5-star rating that 5-star rating applies not just to a male driver, but also to a female driver?
Yes, I mean, look, history is riddled, unfortunately, in the United States and elsewhere with companies and corporations not moving on behalf of the changing demographics until politics gets involved. And there's a number of ways we can get politics involved. But here's an interesting statistic. Now, we've all been talking about the NCAP 5-star rating, which started in 1972 and hasn't been updated. Let's look at what our country looks like right now. In 1972, there were 15 women, both in the Senate and the House. Today, we have 143. We have a female vice president. We have Susan Rice, the domestic policy advisor, who says in everything that she looks at, she has now been told she has to take into account equity. President Biden has said he's going to create an office of women for women and children that will be in the White House. So we have all these trigger points now that we did not have in 1972. And I think the time is right for us to bring the attention to these leaders that there is a danger that is out there that has not been addressed by the government, by the OEMs. And I think there's also another point. We all react to the voters and the consumers. And Chris talked about the fact that we're not a niche market. We're 51% of the drivers. We're also 62% of the purchases of new cars. So when you put the economy and consumer together with trying to impact elected officials and our regulators, I think it's a really good time for us to be talking about this and to bring this attention to the United States Congress, to the Department of Transportation, and to the Biden administration writ large.
Automakers, Susan, often come forward with new innovations on their own. But here's an issue where sometimes maybe automakers need to be pushed in a certain direction, and pushed, I mean, by regulators. That's right, where the government comes into play. Is this something that could actually happen? Is this the time that it could happen with a new administration, with a new transportation secretary, with new bureaucrats essentially in control of the levers of government? Yes, absolutely. Again, when we talk about a niche market, as Caroline talked about, right, we are the people who are more aware than anything that women are not a niche market anymore are the elected officials and the people on the Hill, right? I mean, they now saw through several last election cycles that women, over 52% of the electorate right now, can demand change. And so I think this is the time. Car manufacturers and everybody, I mean, again, this is when you want to talk about that
Women's Health Initiative, where for years in this country, we only tested on men. The aspirin studies, stopping heart attacks, et cetera, all these studies that the taxpayers were paying for only had males as the people they were testing on, because the woman's body was just too complicated. And once there was an outcry, the Women's Health Initiative started and it changed. I think the time is absolutely right, with so many women in Congress, with women being the dominant car purchasers and voters, to make this change.
Caroline, how important is that public opinion and that pushing coming from women to make these types of changes with these not only auto manufacturers, but even with the bureaucrats, with the regulators, to make these types of changes?
Yeah, I think it's really important. Until people start demanding a change, these changes don't tend to happen. I think the issue that we have is that, women are hampered by a lack of data. One of the best ways that we could get automobile manufacturers to actually move on this would be if there were a 5-star rating that said this car did really well on women, but not so well on men, or the other way around, i.e. sex disaggregating the data. And at the moment we don't have that. I'm a female car driver. I would like to know, when I buy a car, how well did this car do on a female dummy, and ideally an anthropometrically correct female dummy rather than just a scaled down male dummy in the passenger seat, right? I would like to know if it protects me. But because we aren't collecting that data, and because we aren't presenting it in a sex disaggregated way, i.e. separated by sex and gender, women don't have that information. And that makes it much harder for us to be able to vote with our feet, which is really one of the most powerful ways. As Susan was pointing out, we make up the majority of purchases, but we're not able to purchase in a way that drives change. And that is what would be really fantastic, and what would really enable this great body of women who, supposedly have all this power now, to actually exercise that power, in a positive way.
Chris, is this?
We're not going to do it in a bad way. Don't worry.
Exactly. Chris, is this a cost issue? Has this always been a cost issue, or does it go beyond that?
Well, when somebody doesn't want to do something, if an OEM doesn't want to add a new test or variation, it's always a cost issue. It's always going to be more expensive. The car is going to be more expensive. But if you look at a test standard that hasn't changed, the same dummy has been in use with minor changes for 40 years. It's hard to believe. We did an analysis of the most expensive car crash test dummy across all vehicles, and it comes out to pennies on a particular car. And when you look at saving lives, of course, I would think pennies are worth the investment in order to do that. If you look at the fatalities across the world, at 1.25 million of fatalities, and obviously you can do the proration of women and to men in there, which is significant. In the US, fatality rate is really kind of stalled for years at 40,000 deaths per year, which is crazy, which is a huge amount that we've just accepted is okay. And we ought to be, we ought to be certainly upset about that, as well as the disparity here, that if a woman goes and she's looking at a car, as the majority of the buyers, as Susan pointed out, there's no differentiation on whether they're going to be as safe as a man or not. And, that's not right. Everybody should be equally safe. And as technology has advanced, we can make cars safer. We have the tools, and those tools are there to test, to make sure that they are safer for the different gender differences. And we have to bring new technology from 40 years up to the present.
What's the process, Chris, to make these changes in our regulations for crash test dummies, for instance? Is it a lengthy process? Is it something that can be done in a matter of a year or two, or does it go beyond that?
Well, anything can happen quick if there's the right emphasis behind it. And I'm very encouraged to hear, even on this call here between Susan and Caroline, how change can happen in other markets with the will of people. And I think here, as women have, a stronger voice and are heard, I think there's an opportunity for very quick change. Now, traditionally, it's been very long change. Obviously, if the same testing device has been around for 40 years, even though if you look at how much technology has changed, In 1980, I could climb inside a car and I could, change the belts and the plugs and every part when it was necessary. Today, you have hundreds of sensors in a car that you didn't have before. Technology has changed. Every model year, there's a new advance. And safety has advanced, don't get me wrong. It has continued to get better. But we need to move much faster in being able to measure the safety levels. And as people have changed, and now women have become more populous in the driving forum, we need to make changes there that reflect the current population. And also, elderly and even overweight people, and I say overweight carefully because actually the new norm for somebody is actually, what would have been considered overweight or even obese in 1980, but yet the standard is still around a very thin male or female person.
Susan, is this just a problem that needs to be resolved, in your view, by government, by the federal government, or could manufacturers, the auto companies, take the lead here and maybe use this as a selling point, for engineering their product so that they can make that as a selling point? Our vehicle is safe for women. Our vehicle is a vehicle that is safer than our competitors for women drivers. What's your view on that?
So yes to both.
Yeah.
First of all, I think government has a role to play, and it has a role to step up right now. On the other hand, I think what it is a selling point, and it's not just for women, right? Men go out and buy cars for their daughters and want to make sure that it is as safe as possible. That's what we all look at. I have 2 daughters who are driving right now. What's the one thing we looked at when they bought cars? Safety. That was the number one thing we had to agree on. If we look back to hybrid cars, right? That was a big selling point, and Toyota and Honda, kind of kicked America's butt for a few years until our OEM said, hey, this is a selling point. This can be the same thing. We just have to make sure that they see that as a selling point and step out. I think particularly as we're in a point of history where we have a lot of these OEMs and people who have not created cars before are now going into autonomous vehicles. Let's make sure that as we're creating the new cars of the future, we're doing it with the mistakes of the past in mind.
Caroline, you've studied this issue as it relates to not just what's happening in the United States, but what's happening around the world. And you have China and Japan and Europe. They seem to be leading in terms of safety regulations. And I'm curious, does the US government have a responsibility to regulate higher standards as well, so that the US OEMs have this level playing field with our competitors in these other parts of the world?
I mean, obviously, I'm going to say yes. I think that every regulator has a moral responsibility to be making regulations that are going to protect the entire user population of whatever product it is. And I just want to make a point about the manufacturers. I think that it's right and that this can be seen as a selling point for them, but there also has to be an independent test, because we've already seen, when it came to emissions, there were manufacturers who were kind of fudging the numbers a little bit on that. And I would always want to have, an outside independent, whether it's NCAP or NHTSA, whoever it is, saying, yes, actually, this car is safer for women. So I think it's a carrot and a stick, and it's really a good idea to present this to car manufacturers as the selling point, because it is a selling point. I genuinely would buy a car that was presented to me as safer for women, but I'm not going to just trust a manufacturer who just tells me that and doesn't present me any data and doesn't have their data checked by an independent regulator.
What's your take on that, Chris? Because as part of your job, you are talking to these various regulators, these government agencies. What are your conversations like with them over the years on this particular issue?
Well, that's a very challenging question to answer, but let me start with the question you were talking about with OEMs versus the government. And I agree. I think you need some checks and balances in place, because we've seen Dieselgate, we've seen some challenges out there on when the Insurance Institute adopted the small overlap crash, and car companies were, reluctant at first to do it. And then when they did it very quickly and improved safety, but then only for the driver's side, not for the passenger side. So it requires a certain level of checks and balances. And like with Dieselgate, it was all confirmed they did it, but you had to run the test to confirm it actually did it. And so, we talk about gender disparity. Why wouldn't any NCAP in the world have both a driver that's male and female? Why do we have to pick one? It should be both, because we're all going in it. My wife might drive it. Susan brought up my daughter might drive it. My son might drive it. We aren't determining who's driving and who's not driving. So if both are going in, then both should be tested. It's that simple. Test for both the male and the female. Let's not worry about how many are being tested or not being tested. The answer is both. Every seating position should have a male and a female in it so that we can ensure that every seating position is safe, period. I think it really comes down to that simple. So, for me to guess what the governments are thinking or doing, I'm not qualified to do that. I know that the technology has been available. The Thor 50th has been around in the US first. Actually, US was the leader in crash test safety from the beginning. There's no question about it. And even some of their ideas certainly project the interest to lead is there as we develop the Thor. They've had the Thor 50th for 6 or 7 years, and yet they were not the first to put it into the NCAP. Europe was the first, followed by China, followed by Japan. So actually the US will be the last to the market. And for me, that's greatly disappointing. And they know it, but I don't, there's a lot of politics involved, and Susan is probably much more able to expand on why it takes longer. But I think public opinion is the time is now to say we're not okay with delays. And the Thor 5th has been around, and yet that's not in. And how can we have the most biofidelically advanced dummy in the world recognized by NHTSA themselves and other agencies and not have that in the market?
Explain to me, Chris, how this in a perfect world would work if you did indeed have the auto manufacturers take into account that you have different types of drivers in the driver's seat. You have males, you have females, you have teenagers in the driver's seat. How would that work in the sense that would there be a sensor that could detect who's in the driver's seat? Would you have to push a button to indicate your size so that the vehicle could adjust itself accordingly? Just explain what's at stake here.
Yeah, great question, because by having a single device in a seat, like a male 50th, you only have to develop your restraint system, and meaning pretensioners, airbags, seat belts, everything that goes with that, around that one standard. And yet you're limiting what the reality of the world is. What should happen is the restraint system should be adaptable. We already have weight sensors. We know the person who's in the seat, how much they weigh. We know how much slack is in the seatbelt, so we know the girth of the person that we're trying to get around. We have other technologies that shows even cameras inside the car for drowsiness or for alertness on some of the ADAS systems. They could be used to determine the size, shape, and in the most part, that technology is already there. So with that information, you're asking an excellent question. Why aren't these adaptable restraint systems? We've argued on how much pressure should be on airbag, depending on if you're 280 pounds or whether you're 120 pounds. Well, of course, if you're trying to design one car to work with one person, that's not going to work. We're not going to have the safest outcome. But the technology is there to make adaptable restraints. And by having a test measurement system that has more than one size required in a seat, now you're starting to make that reality come true in my mind.
And if I could just add something to that,
sure.
Sorry to interrupt, but it just occurred to me that one of the issues you also have with the adaptability is, even though it is sometimes already available, you often have to pay extra to have it. So it's like a surcharge tax on being female. You know, if you want to have a restraint that is adjustable, sure, you have to buy the car new and you have to pay extra to have that bit installed. That should not be allowed. It shouldn't be allowed to, you know, essentially tax someone for having the body that what was it, 51% of drivers have. And I would really like to see a lot of pressure put on car manufacturers to outlaw that practice as well.
Susan, I wanted to come to you. I may be dating myself, but I remember when that center rear brake light was put on automobiles. I think the nickname was a Liddy light because it happened during the when Elizabeth Dole was the transportation secretary. How long does something like that take to even get that type of change on an automobile? Just to get my head around how long what it is that you all are advocating could possibly take to get this type of procedure put in place for automobiles going forward?
Look, I think it depends on the patience of the consumers and the patience of legislators. I don't believe that this change would take very long. I'm listening to all these arguments and I keep thinking, oh, if I was, and I served on the transportation committee, if I was still on the transportation committee, boy, I would be having a hearing on this next week, because this is an issue that is begging for political attention. And so it should not take that long.
I'm curious, just to follow up on that, Susan, what can be done by the President Biden, in terms of executive action? I know that he's already signed an executive order. Could this apply to this particular issue?
I'm not sure about that, but I do know that with regard to the executive order, where Susan Rice is the domestic policy advisor, has to have equity in it. Every decision has to have equity in it. And again, once the Women and Children's Office is open, to sit down with Transportation Secretary Buttigieg and say, we need this fixed right now. So I don't even know that you would need an executive order. I think you would just need pressure from the executive to make this happen. And again, I think this is what we've all talked about. This is one of these issues that when people find out about it, it will create change.
When you talk about change, Caroline, how do you mobilize that change? How do you mobilize public opinion? Does it start literally from the ground up? Does it start with organizations like Chris's? Explain to me where does it come from both places and coalesces to the point where you have lawmakers and regulators coming together to come up with solutions together?
I think it's all of them. I think where it starts, and naturally I would say this because I'm someone who talks about data a lot, but it starts with data. It starts with information. It starts with people knowing that this is a thing that exists, a problem that happens. Most people, it would not occur to them that we are still in 2021 mainly testing car crash safety on a dummy based on an American male from the 1970s or perhaps even the 1950s. It just doesn't occur to people. So the number one thing is people just knowing that this is an issue. And then it is a case of, lawmakers are incredibly important here, but they need to know that their constituents care about this. So it is a question of calling, in the UK, your MP, in the US, your congressperson, I guess, making them know that you care about this. I think also there is something to be said for making your opinion known on social media to the manufacturers themselves. Don't let them get away with this. When they release a new car, the first question being asked should be, did you test this on a female car crash test dummy? Which tests did you use that dummy for? They need to be feeling the heat. And that is what, the general population, but also lawmakers can be doing. Media organizations, this comes from everyone. Everyone has to be pushing to make this change happen, because ultimately, this is something we have been talking about for a while now. I mean, the general public hasn't, but certainly within car crash safety circles, I know Chris has been talking about this for a really long time. There may now be some movement because it's been spoken about more broadly. And that, I think, shows the importance of public opinion, that you need to get it known by a wider audience, and then you start to see some legislative change.
And Chris, Humanetics, what are you doing? What can you do to move this particular issue forward?
Well, the only thing Humanetics can really do, John, is make sure technology is available. So we work with everyone in the community of safety to try to make sure that these test products are available. Getting them in use is the next thing. But to revert back on your question, this isn't a complex problem. This isn't putting somebody on Mars tomorrow. The Euro NCAP, if we use them as an example, they did it. They introduced many more tests of pedestrian safety for people walking, running, cyclists. They've added multiple levels of added safety over the last several years. And if they can do it, clearly we can do it. I wonder if we make it more complex with maybe too many lawyers in the process, because they follow an NCAP process. The NCAP is voluntary. You put that out there. It's not a law. It's not a legal requirement. It's up to you. If you want to meet the 5-star crash rating, then you follow the process. And so we could start as an NCAP. Of course, we do that. We have a US NCAP. And to put that in doesn't require an act of Congress or presidential, voting. It really just requires common sense to say, guys, we need to do it. I know there's a lot of tensions and lobbying and politics, but at the end of the day, we've had this product. It's been put into Europe years ago. It could be put in tomorrow into the US NCAP. And the Thor 5th could be put in exactly the same time, and quite frankly, give the US an advantage of safety. We can get back to the front with maybe 1 or 2 movers in Washington to make it happen.
Susan, oftentimes industry views regulators as the enemy. I don't know if that's the case as it regards to this particular issue, but it seems that this is an issue in which the two sides, industry and regulators, industry and government lawmakers, can actually collaborate together in finding a solution on this particular issue.
Yes, I agree 100%. And I want to, follow up with what Caroline said. To the people who are watching this, this is one of those issues where if you contact your member of Congress, if you contact your United States Senator, if you go on social media, this will help move this much more quickly. I actually think you're absolutely right. I think there does not have to be a lot of tension here. I think there just has to be a lot of attention brought on it. And I think this may be one of the issues that Republicans and Democrats can finally agree upon, and that's the safety of our female drivers. I think this can happen quickly. And I think, as I said before, I think everybody's in the right place to make it happen. We just need to bring public attention to Washington, D.C. to make sure, because there's a lot of issues that are out there, right? So, what we're also talking about is fighting to get in the queue, if you will. And that happens through public attention and public participation. So contacting your senators and your members of Congress, going on social media means I want this issue to rise to the top of your action and your attention.
And I think also what makes it easier is this is an easy win, right? Yeah. Like as Chris says, the technology is there. That's not, all the, perhaps all the progress that we're going to need in the world, but certainly to make things a lot better very, very quickly. That's just so easy to do. Yeah. And if there's one thing I've learned, not from being a politician, but from working with politicians, is that they do like an easy win. And I think that that's another reason to really actually this time, if it's something you don't really like doing, you feel uncomfortable doing, you think, what's the point? I'm just one person. Enough people getting in touch with a politician with an easy win, that is also a way that change can get made very, very quickly.
Well said.
Well, if now is the time, it seems, to try to get that easy win, to try to get that bipartisanship that's so been lacking in Washington, D.C. And Caroline, Susan, Chris, you raised some terrific issues, and hopefully the people that can make these changes are listening to everything that you said today. Thank you so much. A really useful conversation.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.